The climb was relentless, a winding serpent of a dirt road that clawed its way up the sheer face of the Blackwood Range. Each turn revealed another dizzying drop, another expanse of ancient, silent forest. Elias Thorne, his lean frame already tired from the journey that had spanned 3 states and countless hours of driving, gripped the steering wheel of his old, battered pickup truck. The engine groaned in protest, a weary companion to his own internal exhaustion, as it strained against the incline. Dust, fine and red, billowed in their wake, coating the sparse pines that clung precariously to the mountainside. Below, the world unfurled in a vast, indifferent tapestry of dark green, punctuated by the occasional glint of granite, sharp and unforgiving, and the shimmering ribbon of a distant river, a silver thread in the immense landscape. Above, silhouetted against a bruised twilight sky that bled from a hazy orange to a deep bruised purple, stood the Sentinel's Roost Fire Lookout Tower. Its weathered timber and rusted struts seemed to hum with an ancient song, a low, resonant vibration that Elias felt deep in his chest. It was a welcome that felt suspiciously like a warning, a premonition he chose to ignore. Elias, a man whose late 30s had etched deep lines of weariness around his eyes, felt a familiar ache settle in his chest. It wasn't the physical exertion of the climb, though his muscles protested the long hours of driving, but the phantom weight of a past he couldn't outrun. The memory, a flickering specter of searing heat and acrid smoke, clung to him like a shroud, a constant, low thrum beneath the surface of his consciousness. He had sought this desolate peak, this isolated sentinel, for one reason: to lose himself. The constant hum of the city, the sympathetic glances, the whispered condolences, they had all become unbearable, suffocating him with their well-meaning pity. Here, amidst the vast, silent wilderness, he hoped the profound quiet would finally cauterize the raw, festering wound of his grief. He craved an emptiness that mirrored his own, a place where the world's clamor couldn't reach him. He parked the truck at the base of the final ascent, a steep, narrow path barely wide enough for a single person, let alone the ghosts that pursued him. The air, thin and crisp, carried the invigorating scent of pine needles and damp earth, a welcome change from the stale, recycled air of his old life. A gust of wind, a constant, mournful companion in these high altitudes, whispered through the trees. A sound that seemed to carry his name, or perhaps a forgotten echo of it. A premonition of what awaited him. He ignored the chill it sent down his spine. He shouldered his duffel bag, its familiar weight a strange comfort, and began the final climb, his boots crunching on loose shale, each step a deliberate act of leaving everything behind. The tower itself was a skeletal silhouette against the fading light, its wooden bones creaking a welcome that sounded suspiciously like a warning. It stood perhaps 60 feet tall, a square cabin perched atop a steel lattice, accessed by a winding, open-air staircase that spiraled upwards into the vastness. As he ascended, the wind plucked at his clothes, a cold, insistent tug, and the world seemed to fall away beneath him, replaced by an endless expanse of dark, brooding forest. The sheer scale of it was humbling, almost frightening, but Elias found a grim satisfaction in his own insignificance against such immensity. The interior of the cabin was Spartan, functional, stripped of any superfluous comfort. A narrow cot, a small, scarred wooden table, a two-way radio, and a well-used logbook. The previous lookout, a man named Miller, had left it meticulously organized, every item in its place, every surface wiped clean. Elias ran a hand over the smooth, worn wood of the desk, feeling the faint indentations left by countless hands. The pages of the logbook were filled with neat, unremarkable observations, smoke reports, weather patterns, wildlife sightings, a testament to the predictable, almost monotonous rhythm of the job. Watch for smoke. Report anomalies. Simple. Elias craved simple. He craved the kind of simplicity that allowed his mind to go blank, to cease its endless churning of regret. He spent his first few days establishing a routine, a ritualistic dance with solitude that bordered on the obsessive. Mornings began before dawn, with a cup of instant coffee brewed over a small propane stove, the rich, earthy aroma mingling with the crisp mountain air. He'd watch the sun bleed across the eastern horizon, painting the sky in fiery hues of orange and crimson, before settling into his chair, the powerful binoculars becoming an extension of his gaze. He scanned the horizon, quadrant by quadrant, meticulously charting the shifting shadows of the clouds, identifying the subtle variations in the forest canopy, searching for the telltale plume of smoke. The job demanded hypervigilance, a relentless focus that left little room for the gnawing thoughts of his past, the searing images that still haunted his waking hours. His reclusive nature, often a burden in the bustling world below, was a virtue here. There were no small-talk expectations, no forced smiles, no need to explain the perpetual weariness in his eyes, the haunted look that seemed to cling to him. The only sound, aside from the wind and the occasional cry of a hawk circling high above, was the rhythmic crackle of the radio, a constant, low hum that was more background noise than communication. He rarely spoke into it, preferring to listen to the clipped, professional voices of other lookouts, their disembodied reports a comforting reminder of a world that continued, even without his active participation. He was a ghost among the living, and this tower was his chosen purgatory. Nights were consumed by the vast, starry expanse. The Blackwood Range, far from any significant light pollution, offered a dizzying canvas of constellations, nebulae, and the milky smear of the galaxy. It was a spectacle so immense, it made his own sorrows feel infinitesimally small, a speck of dust in an infinite void. He'd stand by the large panoramic windows, his breath fogging the glass, and just watch, lost in the cosmic ballet. The silence was profound, broken only by the distant hoot of an owl, or the rustle of unseen creatures in the undergrowth. He found a strange, almost morbid comfort in the idea that he was utterly alone, miles from the nearest human soul. The isolation at first was a balm. The vastness of the forest, silent and indifferent, mirrored the emptiness within him, a comfortable echo. He was finally alone, truly alone, and for a fleeting moment, as the stars wheeled overhead and the wind sang its ancient song, he almost felt peace. He told himself this was what he needed. This was where he would heal. This was where the ghosts of his past would finally fade into the vast, indifferent wilderness, consumed by the sheer immensity of nature. He was wrong. The wilderness had its own scars, and they ran deeper than Elias could ever imagine. The roost was not a sanctuary. It was a trap, and he, Elias Thorne, had just walked willingly into its embrace. As May bled into June, then July, a palpable shift occurred in the Blackwood Range. The crisp mountain air, once invigorating, grew thick and still, heavy with the oppressive weight of an encroaching summer. It was a heat that didn't just warm the skin, It seemed to press in, suffocating, stealing the very breath from his lungs. A stifling, almost suffocating heat settled over the mountains, baking the earth, turning the vast forest into a tinderbox. The scent of pine needles and dry earth intensified, mingling with the faint, acrid tang of distant dust, a premonition of the fires that might come. Elias found himself constantly wiping sweat from his brow, his skin perpetually clammy, his clothes clinging uncomfortably to his lean frame. The sun, a merciless orb in a sky of bleached blue, beat down on the tower, turning the cabin into a slow roasting oven, its wooden walls radiating stored heat long into the night. It was with the onset of this relentless heat that the subtle disturbances began. Elias, accustomed to the deep silence of the mountains and the rhythmic crackle of his radio, started to notice faint anomalies. At first, they were easy to dismiss, products of an overactive imagination or the strain of constant vigilance. A fleeting shadow caught in the periphery of his vision, gone before he could truly register it, like a phantom limb of the landscape. A sudden, inexplicable chill in the sweltering air, quickly replaced by the oppressive warmth, as if an unseen presence had passed through the cabin. He'd rub his arms, shiver, and then dismiss it as a trick of the air currents, a draft he hadn't noticed before. Then came the radio. The constant, low hum of static, once a comforting background noise, began to carry something else. A faint, almost imperceptible whisper would sometimes cut through the white noise, a sound so delicate it was barely there, yet insistent. Not words, not at first, but a low, sibilant sound, like dry leaves rustling in a wind that wasn't there, or a distant, sorrowful sigh. A sound that seemed to emanate from the very air itself. Elias would tap the receiver, adjust the antenna, muttering about faulty wiring or atmospheric interference. He'd scan the frequency dial, convinced it was a stray signal from a distant, poorly tuned station, or perhaps the faint echo of a conversation from miles away. Yet a cold knot would form in his stomach each time it happened, a prickle of unease that lingered long after the sound faded, a subtle discord in the otherwise perfect silence. He was a pragmatic man, grounded in logic, and these fleeting sounds, these phantom whispers, defied easy explanation, chipping away at his carefully constructed calm. More unsettling were the peculiar entries in the old logbook. He'd often leave it open on the desk, his own observations for the day neatly added in his hurried, looping script. He was meticulous, almost obsessive about his records, but on several occasions he'd return to find new passages written in a hand that was not his own, yet unsettlingly familiar. These entries were terse, often just a single line, detailing non-existent smoke plumes or unusual atmospheric conditions. They were always unsettling, a subtle wrongness that jarred against the methodical nature of the logbook. One morning, after a particularly restless night spent listening to the wind and the imagined whispers, he found a new entry. It was scrawled across a fresh page, the ink still seeming damp, smoke from the west, thin, like memory. It calls. Elias frowned, picking up his binoculars, scanning the horizon through the shimmering heat haze, then the sky. Nothing. Not a wisp, not a haze. The air was clear, if oppressively hot, the view unobstructed for miles. He ran a hand over the page, feeling the faint indentation of the pen, the slight roughness of the paper. It looked exactly like his handwriting, the same slight slant, the same way he formed his S's, the same hurried pressure he often applied. But he knew, with a certainty that chilled him more than any phantom breeze, that he hadn't written it. He'd simply shake his head, a gesture of weary resignation, attributing it to fatigue or perhaps a prank by an overzealous ranger during a resupply run. Though none had visited in weeks, he was, after all, completely isolated. The logical explanations, however, felt increasingly thin, stretched taut against an inexplicable reality that was slowly, insidiously, encroaching upon his solitude. The quiet comfort he had found in the isolation was slowly beginning to fray. The vast, indifferent wilderness, once a balm, now felt like a silent observer, its ancient trees watching him, waiting. The subtle disturbances, once dismissed, were now accumulating, forming a pattern of unease that Elias, despite his best efforts, could no longer entirely ignore. The sun, once a source of warmth and light, now felt like a burning eye, fixed on him, relentless and unforgiving, its heat a constant, oppressive reminder of the growing dread. He found himself checking the logbook more frequently, his heart thumping a little faster each time he approached the desk, half dreading, half expecting to find another impossible entry, another piece of evidence that his mind was betraying him. The solitude, once his sanctuary, was subtly, insidiously, turning into something else entirely, a crucible perhaps, or a cage. The relentless heat continued its siege, turning the Blackwood Range into a shimmering, breathless expanse. The air hung heavy and still, a suffocating blanket that pressed down on Elias, stealing his breath, making every movement an effort. He found himself drinking gallons of water, yet always feeling parched, his throat perpetually dry. The cabin was a constant oven, the wood radiating the day's stored warmth, making sleep a desperate, fleeting escape. His nights, already light and restless, became increasingly fragmented, punctuated by vivid, unsettling dreams that dissolved into vague anxieties upon waking, leaving him more exhausted than before. He would wake with a start, heart pounding, convinced he had heard something, only to be met by the oppressive silence. The whispers on the radio grew bolder, more distinct, weaving themselves into the very fabric of the static. They were no longer just sibilant sounds. Elias sometimes caught fragmented words, phrases that danced on the edge of comprehension, always just out of reach, like a half-remembered nightmare. They spoke of loss, flame, regret, and sometimes a chilling, drawn-out Elias. The sound of his own name, distorted and mournful, sent a shiver down his spine that had nothing to do with the heat. He'd snapped the radio off, the sudden silence that followed more jarring than the sounds themselves, leaving a ringing echo in his ears. He'd paced the small cabin, running a hand through his unkempt beard, pulling at the stubble, trying to shake off the creeping dread, the insidious feeling that he was not alone. Then came the logbook entries that truly unsettled him, pushing the boundaries of his rational mind to their breaking point. They were undeniably in his own hurried, looping handwriting, the ink often smudged as if written in haste, yet he had no memory of putting pen to paper. The details were horrifyingly precise, describing events that could not have happened. One morning, he found a page filled with detailed observations of a phantom smoke plume, seen only by him, its description chillingly precise. A column of black, coiling smoke, like a serpent rising from the valley floor. It has no source. It breathes. Its breath is sorrow. And then, scrawled at the bottom, a line that made his blood run cold, a feeling of utter helplessness washing over him. It speaks in shadows. It hungers for what was lost. He tore the page out, his hands trembling violently, a cold sweat breaking on his brow. He crumpled it into a tight ball, his knuckles white, then, in a desperate, almost superstitious act, carried the bin outside and emptied it into the wind, watching the paper shred and dissipate into the vastness, hoping to erase the impossible words. But the next day, it was back, neatly reinserted, the paper smooth and uncreased, as if it had never been touched, along with the new entry. The footsteps are clearer now. They climb. They seek the light. That afternoon he heard them. Not just a faint creak, but a distinct rhythmic thump, thump, thump on the wooden stairs leading up to the observation deck. It was too heavy for a squirrel, too deliberate for the wind. It sounded like someone ascending, slowly, methodically, their weight shifting on each step. Elias froze, his hand instinctively gripping the worn railing of the interior staircase, his knuckles white. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drum in the oppressive silence of the cabin, a silence that felt heavy with expectation. "Hello?" he called out, his voice thin and reedy, cracking with disuse, barely a whisper. "Is anyone there?" Only the mournful sigh of the wind answered, a sound that now seemed to carry a mocking undertone, a low guttural chuckle that reverberated through the ancient wood of the tower. He peered down, his eyes scanning the empty stairwell, the unbroken ground below. Nothing. The stairs were empty, stretching down into the dimness below. The phantom footsteps became a recurring torment, a relentless invisible presence in his isolated world. Sometimes they were slow, deliberate, as if someone were ascending with great effort, each step a heavy, dragging sound. Other times, they were quick, almost frantic, like a desperate flight, a terrified scramble up the stairs. He'd hear them just outside the cabin door, a heavy tread, then a faint scratching sound, as if something with long, sharp nails were trying to get in, trying to find a purchase on the rough wood. He'd fling the door open, his heart pounding, his breath ragged, only to be met by the vast, empty expanse of the forest, the wind his only companion. Elias began to sleep less, his nights consumed by a restless dread that gnawed at the edges of his sanity. He'd lie on his cot, staring at the ceiling, every creak of the old tower, every rustle of the wind through the pines, every distant animal cry amplified into a potential threat. His days became a blur of hypervigilance, his eyes constantly darting, scanning, searching for the source of these impossible occurrences, his ears straining for the faintest whisper, the softest creak, the next phantom step. He tried desperately to rationalize, to find logical explanations. The heat was getting to him. The isolation was playing tricks on his mind. He was tired, stressed, grief-stricken. But the evidence mounted against him, a relentless tide of the inexplicable, eroding his grip on reality. The solace he had sought in solitude was transforming into a suffocating presence, a cage from which his mind desperately sought an escape. The vast, indifferent wilderness, once a balm, now felt like a silent, ancient entity, watching him, waiting, its patience endless. The relentless heat continued its siege, baking the mountains, turning the air into a shimmering, breathable haze that clung to the skin like a damp shroud. Elias, perpetually damp with sweat, felt as though he were living in a slow-roasting oven, his body constantly fighting the oppressive warmth. The cabin's interior offered no respite, the wood radiating the day's stored heat long into the suffocating nights, making sleep a desperate, fleeting escape. His sleep, already fragmented and haunted by vague anxieties, now offered no true rest, punctuated by vivid, unsettling dreams that dissolved into terrifying clarity upon waking, leaving him more exhausted than before. He would wake with a start, heart pounding, convinced he had heard something, only to be met by the oppressive silence, a silence that now felt heavy with unseen presences. His reclusive nature, once a shield against the world, was now a vulnerability, amplifying every strange occurrence, every whisper of the unseen. His attempts to rationalize the events were failing, crumbling under the weight of their persistence. The logbook was no longer a mere anomaly. It was a conversation he didn't remember having, a chilling dialogue with an unseen entity, its words seared into his memory. The footsteps were no longer just echoes. They were a deliberate, taunting presence, a mockery of his solitude, a constant reminder that he was not alone. And then came the visions. They began subtly, fleeting glimpses caught in the periphery of his vision. A flicker of movement in the dense pines below, a shadow that seemed too tall, too gaunt to be a tree, shifting unnaturally. He'd turn his head sharply, but it would be gone, replaced by the familiar monotony of the forest, the swaying branches, the dappled sunlight. He attributed them to fatigue, to the shimmering heat haze distorting his sight, to the strain on his eyes from constant vigilance. But they grew bolder, more insistent. One afternoon, while scanning the western ridge, a figure coalesced in the heat haze just beyond the tree line. It was a man, dressed in an old-fashioned ranger uniform, his face gaunt, his eyes hollowed out like burned embers, staring directly at Elias. He stood motionless for a moment, a spectral sentinel, before dissolving into the shimmering air, leaving behind a faint, acrid scent of ash. Elias gasped, dropping the binoculars, the strap digging into his neck. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drum against the suffocating silence, a rhythm that echoed the phantom footsteps on the stairs. He squeezed his eyes shut, then opened them, half expecting the figure to reappear, to confirm his worst fears. Nothing. Just the endless green expanse, now tainted by the memory of the apparition. These apparitions became more frequent, more vivid, more terrifying. Sometimes they were just a shimmering distortion in the oppressive heat outside the window, like a heat mirage given malevolent form, twisting the air into grotesque shapes. Other times, they were startlingly clear. The details of their worn uniforms, the haunted expressions on their faces, chillingly precise. They would never fully materialize, dissolving before he could focus. But the impression lingered. A silent, desperate terror, a profound anguish that seemed to emanate from them. Once, while he was making coffee, the reflection of a figure seemed to materialize directly behind him in the glass of the window. It was a young woman, her uniform scorched, her eyes wide with a silent scream, her hand pressed against the glass, leaving a faint, ghostly imprint. He spun around, his hand reaching instinctively for the heavy iron skillet by the stove, a pathetic defense against the unseen. But there was nothing. Only the empty cabin, the oppressive heat, and the faint, acrid scent of something like ash, now stronger, more pervasive. He saw its mouth open, as if to speak, but no sound came, only a silent, agonizing plea before it vanished, leaving him trembling. The whispers over the radio intensified, no longer just snatches of sound, but fragmented phrases, imbued with an agonizing grief that seemed to seep into his very soul. "He burns!" One voice seemed to moan, thin and reedy, then another, deeper, almost guttural. "Lost. Everything consumed by the flame." Sometimes they would call his name, a drawn-out, mournful sound that seemed to echo from the very depths of his own despair, a chilling resonance with his own buried trauma. "Elias, why did you come? You brought it here." He'd snap the radio off, his hands shaking, his breath catching in his throat, his mind reeling. The silence that followed was no longer comforting, but a vast, expectant void, waiting for the next manifestation, the next assault on his sanity. He began to question his own sanity desperately. The lines between reality and hallucination, once distinct, were blurring with alarming speed, becoming indistinguishable. He'd pinch himself hard, leaving red marks on his arm, just to feel something real, something that wasn't a product of his unraveling mind. He'd splash cold water on his face, trying to shock himself back to lucidity, but the cool sensation would quickly dissipate in the oppressive heat. But the visions persisted. The whispers grew louder, and the logbook continued its silent, impossible dialogue, a testament to a horror he could no longer deny. His sleep became almost non-existent. He'd lie on his cot, staring at the ceiling, every creak of the old tower, every rustle of the wind through the pines, every distant animal cry, amplified into a potential threat, a sign of the unseen presence. His reclusive nature, once a shield, was now a vulnerability, amplifying every strange occurrence, every flicker of his besieged mind. The vastness of the forest, once comforting, now felt like an all-encompassing, suffocating presence. Its ancient trees whispering secrets he wasn't meant to hear. Its silence a heavy blanket of dread, a profound weight that pressed down on him. The logbook was no longer a mere anomaly. It was a conversation he didn't remember having, a chilling dialogue with an unseen entity, its words seared into his memory. The footsteps were no longer just echoes. They were a deliberate, taunting presence, a mockery of his solitude, a constant reminder that he was not alone. And then came the visions. They began subtly, fleeting glimpses caught in the periphery of his vision. A flicker of movement in the dense pines below, a shadow that seemed too tall, too gaunt to be a tree, shifting unnaturally. He'd turn his head sharply, but it would be gone, replaced by the familiar monotony of the forest, the swaying branches, the dappled sunlight. He attributed them to fatigue, to the shimmering heat haze distorting his sight, to the strain on his eyes from constant vigilance. But they grew bolder, more insistent. One afternoon, while scanning the western ridge, a figure coalesced in the heat haze just beyond the tree line. It was a man, dressed in an old-fashioned ranger uniform, his face gaunt, his eyes hollowed out like burned embers, staring directly at Elias. He stood motionless for a moment, a spectral sentinel, before dissolving into the shimmering air, leaving behind a faint, acrid scent of ash. Elias gasped, dropping the binoculars, the strap digging into his neck. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drum against the suffocating silence, a rhythm that echoed the phantom footsteps on the stairs. He squeezed his eyes shut, then opened them, half expecting the figure to reappear, to confirm his worst fears. Nothing. Just the endless green expanse, now tainted by the memory of the apparition. These apparitions became more frequent, more vivid, more terrifying. Sometimes they were just a shimmering distortion in the oppressive heat outside the window, like a heat mirage given malevolent form, twisting the air into grotesque shapes. Other times, they were startlingly clear. The details of their worn uniforms, the haunted expressions on their faces, chillingly precise. They would never fully materialize dissolving before he could focus. But the impression lingered. A silent, desperate terror. A profound anguish that seemed to emanate from them. Once, while he was making coffee, the reflection of a figure seemed to materialize directly behind him in the glass of the window. It was a young woman, her uniform scorched, her eyes wide with a silent scream, her hand pressed against the glass, leaving a faint, ghostly imprint. He spun around, his hand reaching instinctively for the heavy iron skillet by the stove, a pathetic defense against the unseen. But there was nothing. Only the empty cabin, the oppressive heat, and the faint acrid scent of something like ash, now stronger, more pervasive. He saw its mouth open, as if to speak, but no sound came, only a silent, agonizing plea before it vanished, leaving him trembling. The whispers over the radio intensified, no longer just snatches of sound, but fragmented phrases, imbued with an agonizing grief that seemed to seep into his very soul. "He burns." One voice seemed to moan, thin and reedy, then another, deeper, almost guttural. "Lost. Everything. Consumed by the flame." Sometimes they would call his name, a drawn-out mournful sound that seemed to echo from the very depths of his own despair, a chilling resonance with his own buried trauma. "Elias, why did you come? You brought it here." He'd snapped the radio off, his hands shaking, his breath catching in his throat, his mind reeling. The silence that followed was no longer comforting, but a vast expectant void, waiting for the next manifestation, the next assault on his sanity. He began to question his own sanity desperately. The lines between reality and hallucination, once distinct, were blurring with alarming speed, becoming indistinguishable. He'd pinch himself hard, leaving red marks on his arm, just to feel something real, something that wasn't a product of his unraveling mind. He'd splash cold water on his face, trying to shock himself back to lucidity, but the cool sensation would quickly dissipate in the oppressive heat. But the visions persisted, the whispers grew louder, and the logbook continued its silent, impossible dialogue, a testament to a horror he could no longer deny. His sleep became almost non-existent. He'd lie on his cot, staring at the ceiling, every creak of the old tower, every rustle of the wind through the pines, every distant animal cry amplified into a potential threat, a sign of the unseen presence. His reclusive nature, once a shield, was now a vulnerability, amplifying every strange occurrence, every flicker of his besieged mind. The vastness of the forest, once comforting, now felt like an all-encompassing, suffocating presence. Its ancient trees whispering secrets he wasn't meant to hear. Its silence a heavy blanket of dread, a profound weight that pressed down on him. The tower, he realized with a growing, cold certainty that settled deep in his bones, was not just a lookout. It was a conduit, a prison, and he, Elias Thorne, was trapped within its walls, a willing sacrifice to an ancient hunger, a meal prepared for a monstrous appetite. The solitude, once his refuge, had become the very instrument of his torment, isolating him, making him a solitary meal for something that craved his despair, his very essence. He was utterly alone, yet never truly alone, always in the presence of this consuming dread. Elias was teetering on the precipice of a full breakdown, his body racked by weeks of sleepless nights and a mind tortured by the relentless assault. His lean frame had grown gaunter, his skin stretched taut over sharp bones. His eyes, once deep-set and haunted, now held a frantic, desperate glint, constantly darting, searching, seeing things that weren't there, and terrifyingly, seeing things that were. He moved with a jerky, almost mechanical precision, his every action a desperate attempt to maintain control over a reality that was rapidly dissolving around him, like a sandcastle against an incoming tide. Yet, amidst the terror, a desperate clarity began to emerge, a horrifying understanding that cut through the fog of his unraveling sanity, a cold, sharp blade of truth. The fragments coalesced. The whispers, the visions, the logbook. They were all pieces of a horrifying puzzle, meticulously laid out by an unseen hand, leading him inexorably towards a terrible revelation. He spent hours poring over the logbook, no longer just reading, but deciphering. His fingers tracing the strange symbols, the crudely drawn sigils that now resonated with a chilling familiarity. He dimly remembered a half-forgotten piece of local folklore, whispered around campfires during his brief, forced interactions with other rangers during his initial training. Tales of an ancient evil, a spirit born of primordial fires, sealed away in the heart of these very mountains beneath the earth, bound by ancient rites. They called it the Ashen Tongue. The name now echoed in his mind, not a whisper, but a roar. The tower, he now understood with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, was not merely a lookout. It was a conduit, a prison, a focal point. It had been built perhaps unknowingly, perhaps deliberately, over an ancient spiritual seal meant to contain this very fire-bound entity. The very structure that offered him refuge, that promised solitude and peace, was, in fact, a cage designed to hold something terrible, something that had been dormant for centuries, slowly gathering strength. And as temperatures rose and the isolation deepened, that something was awakening, stirring from its long slumber, its hunger growing. He felt it, a profound cold that no heat could dispel, settled deep in his bones, even as the air in the cabin remained stifling, thick with the scent of ash. It was the cold of ancient malice, of a hunger that transcended time, a primordial emptiness that yearned to be filled. The entity was not merely haunting him. It was attempting to possess him, to fully awaken, to breach the seal that had held it captive for centuries. It was trying to break through the veil of sanity, using his own deepest fears as a weapon, twisting his perception, eroding his will, his past trauma, the fire, the loss, the agonizing guilt. These were not just memories. They were the keys, the fuel, the very kindling for the Ashen Tongue's full manifestation, a perverse offering. He began to speak aloud, his voice hoarse and cracked from disuse, not to himself, but to the invisible presence he now knew was there, surrounding him, permeating the very air. "You want to feed," he rasped, his eyes darting around the cabin, searching for a tangible form. "You want out, and you're using me." He could feel its malevolent attention, a prickling sensation on his skin, a pressure behind his eyes, a cold, insidious touch on his mind. He was a vessel, a potential host, and the entity was testing the limits of his resistance, probing for weaknesses, for cracks in his sanity. The logbook entries, now terrifyingly clear, confirmed his dawning horror. They spoke of previous lookouts who had gone mad, who had vanished, whose disappearances were attributed to the harsh wilderness or isolated madness. But now Elias knew the truth. They were not victims of the mountain, but of the Ashen Tongue. They were the ones who had come before him, the ones whose sanity had been devoured, whose souls had been marked, whose names were now whispered by the wind. He was just the latest in a long, silent line, a new chapter in a horrifying saga. The solitude, once his chosen path, had led him directly into the maw of an ancient, insatiable hunger. He was trapped, utterly alone, yet never truly alone, always in the presence of this consuming dread. And the only escape he could imagine was the complete obliteration of his own mind, a final, desperate surrender. The air thickened, growing impossibly still and heavy, pregnant with an unspoken dread that pressed down on the Blackwood Range. The oppressive heat of the day lingered, a suffocating blanket, but now it was laced with a strange, metallic tang, like ozone and something else, something ancient and acrid, like burnt offerings. The sky, which had been a relentless bleached blue for weeks, began to bruise, turning a sickly purple-black on the horizon, a bruised eye watching the impending chaos. Elias felt it in his bones, a tremor that had nothing to do with the tower's swaying, a deep vibration that resonated with his own internal fear. A storm was coming. Not just a weather event, but something else, something primal and malevolent, a manifestation of the entity's growing power. Late one sweltering August night, it descended upon the Blackwood Range. It was a storm of unprecedented ferocity, a maelstrom of wind and lightning that seemed to tear at the very fabric of reality, ripping the air apart. The first clap of thunder was not a distant rumble, but a deafening explosion directly overhead, rattling the cabin's windows and sending a violent tremor through the steel lattice of the tower. Lightning rent the sky in blinding, searing flashes, illuminating the ancient trees in brief, stark, horrifying detail, their gnarled branches reaching like skeletal claws, their forms twisted and tormented in the incandescent light, caught in a silent scream. The tower groaned under the assault, its wooden bones shrieking in protest, its steel struts vibrating with an unnatural hum, the wind howling through its structure like a hungry beast, desperate to get in or out. The radio, which had been a source of only static and whispers, now erupted into a cacophony of distorted voices, a horrifying symphony of torment. They shrieked, they wept, they begged, their pleas for help swallowed by the raging inferno of the storm, their words dissolving into a static-laden wail. Elias recognized them now, the voices of the previous lookouts, no longer spectral glimpses, but raw, auditory terror. Their agony amplified by the storm's fury, their despair echoing his own. "It burns!" one shrieked, a high-pitched wail that seemed to tear through his eardrums. "He's here." Another sobbed, the sound choked with despair. "He's come for us all." Elias clapped his hands over his ears, pressing them hard, but the sounds penetrated his skull, vibrating through his very bones, a relentless assault on his sanity. He huddled in the center of the observation deck, away from the panoramic windows that threatened to shatter under the storm's fury. His body trembling uncontrollably, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He felt an unbearable pressure in his head, as if his skull would split open, a vice tightening around his brain, squeezing out all rational thought. The visions intensified, no longer fleeting glimpses, but vivid, horrifying tableaus that played out before his eyes like a macabre stage play, projected onto the very air around him, seared into his retina. He saw the previous lookouts, their faces contorted in terror, their bodies racked by an invisible flame, their uniforms smoldering, their skin blistering. He saw their desperate, futile attempts to fight it, to beat back the unseen fire, their pleas for help, their agonizing deaths, their souls consumed by an unseen force, their forms dissolving into ash. And then, the visions turned inward, twisting the knife in his already raw soul. He saw himself, Not as he was now, but as he had been, trapped in the past trauma he had tried so desperately to bury. The memory he had fled to this desolate peak to escape. He relived the fire, the one that had taken everything from him, the one that had left him hollowed out and seeking oblivion in the wilderness. He saw the flames, tasted the smoke, felt the searing heat, heard the screams, not just of the past, but of the present, echoing in the cabin. The images were so real, so visceral, that he cried out, a guttural sound torn from his throat, a sound he barely recognized as his own. The ashen tongue was not just showing him, it was making him feel it again, amplifying his grief, twisting his memories into a torment he thought impossible. It was feeding on him, gorging itself on his despair, growing stronger with every agonizing flicker of his past, every pang of guilt, every wave of sorrow. The tower, his sanctuary, had become his personal hell, and he was trapped within its burning walls. The storm reached its terrifying crescendo, a symphony of destruction and malevolence. The air in the cabin grew scorching hot, heavy with the suffocating scent of ash, and something else, something ancient, vast, and indescribably malevolent. It was the smell of burnt offerings, of forgotten rituals, of a hunger that transcended time, a primordial stench that filled his nostrils and burned his lungs. The very structure of the tower groaned, its steel beams vibrating with an unnatural hum, its wooden planks splintering and cracking under an unseen force. A deep, guttural sound, like something vast and primordial stirring from a long, tormented slumber, reverberated through the tower's very foundations. It wasn't thunder. It was a sound that came from beneath the earth, from within the walls, from inside Elias's own head, a resonant hum that vibrated through his bones. The wood itself seemed to moan in protest, splinters raining down from the ceiling like desiccated tears, each one a tiny shard of dread. The logbook on the desk, forgotten in his terror, began to glow with an internal flickering light, casting grotesque, dancing shadows across the room. The pages, now impossibly vibrant, writhed and reformed, the ink no longer his own, but a jagged, infernal script that pulsed with malevolent energy, a living, breathing entity of pure malice. Each character seemed to burn itself into his retinas, searing the name into his mind, an inescapable brand, Ashen Tongue. The words writhed, forming a single, horrifying command, repeated endlessly, echoing in the confines of the cabin. Submit, submit, submit. The hum of the radio intensified into a deafening roar, a cacophony of tormented voices and crackling energy that vibrated through his bones, threatening to shatter them, to reduce him to dust. The air grew thick, shimmering, distorting the view outside the panoramic windows, twisting the forest into grotesque, writhing shapes. And then, in the center of the observation deck, a grotesque, shimmering form began to coalesce. It was formless, yet terrifyingly present, a vortex of swirling embers and tendrils of smoke, its essence the very embodiment of sorrow and destructive flame. It had no discernible features, no eyes, no mouth. Yet Elias felt its gaze, its hunger, its ancient malevolence, a cold, consuming stare that pierced his very soul. It was not solid, yet it held an undeniable weight, a presence that crushed the air from his lungs, stealing his breath, his sanity, his will. Elias stumbled backward, pressing himself against the cold, vibrating glass of the window, his mind screaming in silent agony, a desperate, unheard plea. He was no longer watching. He was being watched, consumed. The Ashen Tongue was awake, fully manifested, its form swirling and expanding, and it was reaching for him. Tendrils of smoke, not from any fire, but from the entity itself, snaked out, coiling around his ankles, his wrists, his throat. He could feel them, cold yet burning, tightening their grip, constricting his every movement. His own grief, his own memories were being siphoned from him, feeding the insatiable hunger of the entity, a terrifying transfusion of despair. His past trauma, the fire that had scarred him, now became the very instrument of his final torment, burning him from the inside out, consuming his very being. He tried to scream, but no sound came. His throat was constricted, his lungs burning, his vocal cords paralyzed by fear. His vision blurred, the cabin spinning around him, the shimmering form of the ashen tongue growing larger, consuming his field of view, becoming his entire world. He felt a searing pain, not physical, but existential, as if his very soul were being flayed, stripped bare. He was dissolving, becoming one with the ash and smoke, a new fuel for the ancient fire, a new addition to its endless hunger. The last thing he saw before the darkness took him was his own reflection in the window, his eyes wide and vacant, already hollowed out like burned embers, already marked, already gone. The ashen tongue was awake, and it had found its new vessel. The storm, having gorged itself on the mountain's raw energy, and Elias's shattered mind, eventually broke. It left behind a world washed clean by the torrential rains, yet subtly, irrevocably changed. The air, though still heavy with the scent of damp earth and pine, carried a faint, acrid tang, like ash on the wind, a lingering reminder of the inferno that had raged. The sun, when it finally reappeared, felt weak, its light unable to fully dispel the lingering shadows that clung to the forest, as if the very trees had absorbed the darkness. Days later, a resupply team, overdue and concerned by Elias's prolonged radio silence, finally reached the Sentinel's roost. The climb was arduous, the road partially washed out by the recent downpour, adding to the sense of foreboding. As they approached the tower, an unnatural quiet hung in the air, broken only by the distant caw of a crow. No smoke, no sign of life. A chill, unrelated to the mountain air, settled over them. They found him huddled in a corner of the tower's observation deck, his back pressed against the cold, vibrating glass. It was the smell of burnt offerings, of forgotten rituals, of a hunger that transcended time, a primordial stench that filled his nostrils and burned his lungs. The very structure of the tower groaned, its steel beams vibrating with an unnatural hum, its wooden planks splintering and cracking under an unseen force. A deep, guttural sound, like something vast and primordial stirring from a long, tormented slumber, reverberated through the tower's very foundations. It wasn't thunder. It was a sound that came from beneath the earth, from within the walls, from inside Elias's own head, a resonant hum that vibrated through his bones. The wood itself seemed to moan in protest, splinters raining down from the ceiling like desiccated tears, each one a tiny shard of dread. The logbook on the desk, forgotten in his terror, began to glow with an internal, flickering light, casting grotesque, dancing shadows across the room. The pages, now impossibly vibrant, writhed and reformed, the ink no longer his own, but a jagged, infernal script that pulsed with malevolent energy, a living, breathing entity of pure malice. Each character seemed to burn itself into his retinas, searing the name into his mind, an inescapable brand, Ashen Tongue. The words writhed, forming a single, horrifying command, repeated endlessly, echoing in the confines of the cabin. Submit. 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 The hum of the radio intensified into a deafening roar, a cacophony of tormented voices and crackling energy that vibrated through his bones, threatening to shatter them, to reduce him to dust. The air grew thick, shimmering, distorting the view outside the panoramic windows, twisting the forest into grotesque, writhing shapes. And then, in the center of the observation deck, a grotesque, shimmering form began to coalesce. It was formless, yet terrifyingly present. A vortex of swirling embers and tendrils of smoke. Its essence the very embodiment of sorrow and destructive flame. It had no discernible features, no eyes, no mouth. Yet Elias felt its gaze, its hunger, its ancient malevolence. A cold, consuming stare that pierced his very soul. It was not solid, yet it held an undeniable weight, a presence that crushed the air from his lungs, stealing his breath, his sanity, his will. Elias stumbled backward, pressing himself against the cold, vibrating glass of the window, his mind screaming in silent agony, a desperate, unheard plea. He was no longer watching. He was being watched, consumed. The ashen tongue was awake, fully manifested, its form swirling and expanding, and it was reaching for him. Tendrils of smoke, not from any fire, but from the entity itself, snaked out, coiling around his ankles, his wrists, his throat. He could feel them, cold yet burning, tightening their grip, constricting his every movement. His own grief, his own memories were being siphoned from him, feeding the insatiable hunger of the entity, a terrifying transfusion of despair. His past trauma, the fire that had scarred him, now became the very instrument of his final torment, burning him from the inside out, consuming his very being. He tried to scream, but no sound came. His throat was constricted, his lungs burning, his vocal cords paralyzed by fear. His vision blurred, the cabin spinning around him, the shimmering form of the ashen tongue growing larger, consuming his field of view, becoming his entire world. He felt a searing pain, not physical, but existential, as if his very soul were being flayed, stripped bare. He was dissolving, becoming one with the ash and smoke, a new fuel for the ancient fire, a new addition to its endless hunger. The last thing he saw before the darkness took him was his own reflection in the window, his eyes wide and vacant, already hollowed out, like burned embers, already marked, already gone. The ashen tongue was awake, and it had found its new vessel. The storm, having gorged itself on the mountain's raw energy, and Elias's shattered mind, eventually broke. It left behind a world washed clean by the torrential rains, yet subtly, irrevocably changed. The air, though still heavy with the scent of damp earth and pine, carried a faint, acrid tang, like ash on the wind, a lingering reminder of the inferno that had raged. The sun, when it finally reappeared, felt weak, its light unable to fully dispel the lingering shadows that clung to the forest, as if the very trees had absorbed the darkness. Days later, a resupply team, overdue and concerned by Elias's prolonged radio silence, finally reached the Sentinel's roost. The climb was arduous, the road partially washed out by the recent downpour, adding to the sense of foreboding. As they approached the tower, an unnatural quiet hung in the air, broken only by the distant caw of a crow. No smoke, no sign of life. A chill, unrelated to the mountain air, settled over them. They found him huddled in a corner of the tower's observation deck, his back pressed against the cold, vibrating glass. The first name was faded, almost illegible, worn smooth by centuries of unseen forces. But the last few were clearer, etched with a desperate, hurried hand, as if the carver had been fighting it against an unseen force, were 3 familiar initials: E.T., Elias Thorne. The carving was fresh, the edges still sharp, a chilling testament to his recent torment. The revelation sent a shiver through the crew, a cold dread that transcended the biting mountain air. Elias was not the first. He was merely the latest. The names represented a chilling lineage, a succession of lookouts who had come to this isolated peak, seeking solitude, only to find themselves ensnared by an ancient, malevolent force. Their disappearances, their madness, their eventual deaths, all attributed to the harsh wilderness or isolated psychosis, were now revealed as the work of the Ashen Tongue, its silent, insidious hand reaching across generations. The tower was dismantled, its components hauled away, leaving only the scarred bedrock behind, a raw wound on the mountain's face. But the entity, the Ashen Tongue, had not been contained by the tower, nor by its destruction. It had merely used the tower as a focal point, a place to awaken, to feed, to mark its victims. Elias was not consumed entirely. He was branded, a living testament to its power, a memory of its awakening, a silent scream etched into his very soul. And as the Blackwood Range baked under the late summer sun once more, and the whispers began to drift from the now empty peak, carried on the warm currents of the wind, it was clear he would not be the last. The fire, both literal and symbolic, still burned, waiting for its next vessel, its next meal. Somewhere in the sanitarium, Elias Thorne continued to sketch his frantic drawings, his eyes wide and vacant, forever seeing the swirling ash and the burning sorrow, forever hearing the whispers. And somewhere, out in the vast, silent wilderness, the Ashen Tongue stretched its infernal reach, hungry and patient, waiting for the next soul to seek refuge in its ancient domain, drawn by the promise of peace, only to find eternal torment. The roost was gone, but the haunting had only just begun, its tendrils now reaching further than ever before. The mountains held their breath, waiting for the next spark, the next grief, the next victim. The transition from the raw, untamed wilderness to the sterile, muted confines of the Blackwood Valley Sanitarium was jarring, a descent from one kind of prison to another. Elias Thorne was no longer battered by the wind or assaulted by phantom whispers. Instead, he was enveloped by a quiet, almost oppressive calm. The air, filtered and climate-controlled, lacked the scent of pine and damp earth, replaced by the faint, antiseptic tang of disinfectant and stale institutional food. The panoramic views of the mountains were gone, replaced by a single barred window overlooking a manicured lawn and a distant, unremarkable forest line. His first days were a blur of sedatives and hushed conversations he couldn't quite follow. Doctors, their faces kind but distant, spoke in soft, clinical tones. Nurses, gentle but firm, guided him through routines he barely registered. He was a patient, a case study, a mind to be mended. They diagnosed him with extreme exhaustion and acute psychosis, a convenient label for the inexplicable. His tales of the Ashen Tongue, of the burning visions and the insidious whispers, were met with sympathetic nods and prescriptions for stronger tranquilizers. They saw trauma, isolation, and a breakdown. They did not see an ancient evil. Elias, however, knew the entity was not confined to the tower. It was in him. He could still feel the faint, cold tendrils of its presence, a low thrum beneath the surface of his consciousness, a phantom ache in his bones. The sanitarium's walls, thick and solid, felt like a thin membrane against its lingering touch. He would lie on his narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, and sometimes, in the deepest hours of the night, he would hear it. Not the roaring cacophony of the storm, but a soft, sibilant whisper, like dry leaves skittering across a stone floor, just at the edge of his hearing. It feeds. It waits. His sleep was still a fractured landscape, haunted by vivid nightmares. The visions of the previous lookouts, their faces contorted in terror, their bodies consumed by unseen flames, continued to plague him. They were no longer fleeting glimpses, but prolonged, agonizing replays, forcing him to witness their torment again and again. He would wake in a cold sweat, his heart hammering, gasping for breath, only to find the nurses by his side, their expressions concerned, their hands reaching for the sedative. He learned to suppress his cries, to clench his teeth, to suffer in silence, for his outburst only led to more drugs, more oblivion. He resisted the medication at first, fighting against the fog it cast over his mind. He needed to be clear, to be aware, to understand what had happened to him. But the doctors were insistent, and his resistance only led to more forceful interventions. Eventually, the drugs dulled the sharp edges of his terror, blurring the visions, muffling the whispers. He became more compliant, more docile, a shadow of the man who had sought refuge in the mountains. He would sit by the window for hours, staring out at the manicured lawn, his mind a blank slate, his eyes vacant. Yet even in this medicated stupor, a faint, acrid scent of ash would sometimes drift to him, a reminder that the entity was still there, still lurking, still connected. He began to draw. It started as a desperate attempt to capture the images that haunted him, to externalize the horror. The nurses, seeing it as a therapeutic outlet, encouraged him, providing him with notebooks and pencils. His hands, though still trembling, found a strange, almost compulsive rhythm. He drew swirling vortexes of smoke, grotesque, formless shapes that seemed to writhe on the page, their tendrils reaching, consuming. He drew gaunt figures with hollow eyes, their mouths open in silent screams, their bodies consumed by invisible flames. And always in the center of each drawing, a single, all-consuming eye, burning with a malevolent, ancient light. He would scrawl the phrase, "It feeds, it waits," over and over, filling page after page until his fingers cramped, until the pencils wore down to stubs. The nurses would collect his drawings, filing them away as evidence of his delusions, unaware that they were collecting fragments of a terrifying truth. Elias Thorne, the reclusive fire watcher, was now the sanitarium's most perplexing case. He was physically present, but his mind, his soul, was still trapped somewhere between the sterile walls of his room and the burning heights of the Sentinel's roost, forever marked by the ashen tongue. He had sought isolation to escape his past, but he had found something far older, far more insidious, and it had followed him, embedding itself deep within the very core of his being. The sanitarium's walls offered no true sanctuary, only a temporary reprieve from the full force of its malevolence. The sanitarium staff, accustomed to the myriad forms of human suffering, found Elias Thorne to be a particularly unsettling case. Dr. Aris Thorne, a seasoned psychiatrist with a calm demeanor and a keen, analytical mind, was Elias's primary physician. He had seen patients ravaged by trauma, by grief, by the insidious creep of mental illness. But Elias was different. There was a profound, almost ancient despair in his eyes, a depth of horror that transcended typical psychosis. He speaks of a fire-bound entity, Dr. Thorne. Nurse Miller reported, her voice low, as they reviewed Elias's latest batch of drawings. The sketches were disturbing, filled with the recurring motifs of smoke, ash, and the single burning eye. He calls it the ashen tongue, and he insists it's still with him, even here. Dr. Thorne studied the drawings, his brow furrowed. The consistency is remarkable. The detail, the repetition. It suggests a deeply ingrained delusion, perhaps a manifestation of his underlying trauma related to fire. He paused, picking up one drawing where a shadowy form seemed to emerge from a swirling vortex. He believes this entity feeds on grief and memory, a classic projection of his own internal suffering. Yet a subtle unease began to creep into the sanitarium. It started with minor incidents, easily dismissed. A faint, acrid scent, like burnt wood or ash, would occasionally drift through the ventilation system, despite no logical source within the building. Staff members would complain of sudden, inexplicable chills, even in the warmth of the summer months. Small, insignificant fires would occur. A frayed wire sparking in the laundry room, a forgotten cigarette igniting a waste bin. All quickly extinguished, all attributed to mundane causes. But the frequency, though low, was just enough to create a subtle undercurrent of tension. Nurse Miller, a practical woman with years of experience, found herself increasingly unsettled by Elias. He was quiet, almost catatonic at times. But when he spoke, his words were chillingly lucid, despite the sedatives. He would describe the tower, the mountain, the feeling of the entity's presence with such vivid detail that it felt less like a delusion and more like a recounting. One evening, as she administered his medication, Elias's vacant eyes suddenly focused on her, a flicker of desperate awareness in their depths. "You smell it, don't you?" he whispered, his voice raspy. "The ash. It follows." Nurse Miller stiffened, a prickle of unease running down her spine. She had, in fact, noticed the faint scent of ash just moments before, dismissing it as a trick of her imagination. "It's just the air conditioning, Elias," she said, her voice firmer than she felt. He shook his head. A slow, deliberate movement. "It's in the air. It's in the walls. It's in the mountain. It feeds on the sorrow. And there's so much sorrow here." His gaze swept around the room, as if seeing the collective grief of all the patients, all the broken minds within the sanitarium's walls. Dr. Thorne, despite his scientific skepticism, found himself spending more time researching the Blackwood Range. He dismissed Elias's ashen tongue as a symptom, but the sheer consistency of the delusion intrigued him. He delved into local folklore, old geological surveys, even historical accounts of the region. He found vague references to ancient indigenous legends about a fire spirit or a mountain's breath, often associated with periods of drought and widespread forest fires. He dismissed them as quaint superstitions, but the coincidence, however faint, gnawed at him. One night, working late in his office, Dr. Thorne experienced a strange phenomenon. His radio, usually tuned to classical music, suddenly crackled with static, then a faint, sibilant whisper. It was indistinct, but for a moment he thought he heard his own name, drawn out and mournful. He leaned closer, adjusting the dial, but it vanished, replaced by the familiar strains of a cello concerto. He frowned, dismissing it as a momentary atmospheric disturbance, but the image of Elias Thorne's haunted eyes flashed in his mind. The sanitarium, designed as a place of healing and calm, began to feel subtly off-kilter. The staff, though professional, became more prone to irritability, to unexplained anxieties. Patients reported more vivid, disturbing nightmares, often involving fire or suffocating smoke. The quiet hum of the building seemed to carry an almost imperceptible undercurrent, a low, resonant vibration that Elias Thorne, even in his medicated state, could still feel. The ashen tongue, though unseen, was beginning to stretch its influence beyond the confines of the Sentinel's roost, its tendrils reaching down into the valley, subtly poisoning the air, waiting for its next opportunity to feed. The sanitarium's walls, once a symbol of containment, were becoming permeable, allowing echoes of the mountain's ancient horror to seep through. High above the valley, where the Sentinel's roost had stood for decades, a new team arrived. This was not a resupply crew, nor was it a team of eager new lookouts. This was the dismantling crew, a small, specialized unit dispatched by the Forest Service to carefully, methodically take down the tower. The official reason was structural instability, a convenient bureaucratic explanation for a place that had become synonymous with trouble. But among the grizzled, experienced men, whispers circulated. Stories of the last lookout, Elias Thorne, and the ones before him. Stories of madness and disappearance. The team was led by Foreman Jedediah Jed Stone, a man whose face was as weathered as the mountain rock, his hands calloused from years of working with timber and steel. He was a practical man, a man of facts and figures, not superstitions. Yet as their truck climbed the winding, treacherous road, partially washed out by the recent torrential rains, even Jed felt a prickle of unease. The air grew colder the higher they climbed, despite the late summer sun, and it carried a faint, almost imperceptible scent of ash, even though there had been no fires reported in weeks. It clung to their clothes and hair, a ghostly perfume. Their first few days were spent setting up camp, securing the site, and preparing the necessary equipment. The tower itself stood silent, a gaunt skeleton against the sky, its windows dark and empty. It seemed to watch them, a silent, imposing presence. The wind, a constant companion, still sang its mournful song through the skeletal remains, but now it seemed to carry a low, guttural hum beneath its usual wail. A sound that made the hair on the back of their necks stand up. "Place gives me the creeps," muttered Billy, the youngest of the crew, as he wrestled with a heavy wrench. He was a city boy, new to the isolation of the mountains, and his nerves were already frayed. Jed grunted, tightening a bolt on a scaffolding brace. It's old, and it's seen a lot of lonely men. Just get the job done. But even Jed couldn't ignore the subtle anomalies. Tools would go missing, only to reappear in plain sight hours later, in places they couldn't possibly have been. The radio, used for communication between the crew members, would occasionally crackle with static. Then a faint, sibilant whisper, too indistinct to be words, but too persistent to be dismissed as mere interference. They'd all heard the stories of Elias Thorne's radio troubles. One afternoon, as they began to pull up the old splintered floorboards of the observation deck, revealing the raw earth and rock beneath, the air grew noticeably colder. A profound chill emanated from the exposed ground, a cold that seemed to sink into their bones despite the strenuous work. Jed, wiping sweat from his brow, felt a shiver run down his spine. "What in tarnation?" Billy exclaimed, his voice tight with unease. He had unearthed a section of the bedrock beneath where the central console of the lookout tower had stood. Jed knelt, brushing away centuries of grime and dust. What he saw made his breath catch in his throat. Meticulously carved into the ancient foundation stone was a series of symbols. They were crude, yet unmistakable. Ancient sigils, unlike anything he had ever seen, pulsing with a faint, unseen energy that seemed to hum beneath his fingertips. And alongside them, a series of names. The first name was faded, almost illegible, worn smooth by centuries of unseen forces, a mere indentation in the rock. But the last few were clearer, etched with a desperate, hurried hand, as if the carver had been fighting against an unseen force, their last act of defiance. Miller, the name of Elias's immediate predecessor. And beneath Miller's name, carved with a desperate, shaky hand, the edges still sharp and fresh, were 3 familiar initials: E.T., Elias Thorne. Jed stared at the initials, a cold dread spreading through him that transcended the biting mountain's air. Elias was not the first. He was merely the latest. The names represented a chilling lineage, a succession of lookouts who had come to this isolated peak seeking solitude, only to find themselves ensnared by an ancient, malevolent force. Their disappearances, their madness, their eventual deaths, all attributed to the harsh wilderness or isolated psychosis, were now revealed as the work of the Ashen Tongue, its silent, insidious hand reaching across generations. The tower was not just a structure. It was a monument to its victims. The crew worked in silence after that, their movements stiff, their eyes constantly darting. The wind, once a mournful song, now seemed to whisper the names etched in stone, a chorus of tormented souls. The scent of ash intensified, clinging to them like a shroud. They finished the dismantling quickly, driven by a desperate need to escape the cursed peak. The components were hauled away, leaving only the scarred bedrock behind, a raw wound on the mountain's face. But the entity, the Ashen Tongue, had not been contained by the tower, nor by its destruction. It had merely used the tower as a focal point, a place to awaken, to feed, to mark its victims. The men left, but the mountain remembered, and the entity remained, a silent ancient hunger in the heart of the Blackwood Range. In the sterile confines of the sanitarium, Elias Thorne continued his slow, agonizing decline. The sedatives kept him outwardly calm, a placid, vacant expression masking the maelstrom within. But the doctor's notes grew increasingly grim, patient unresponsive to stimuli, persistent delusional ideation, prognosis poor. They spoke of a mind irrevocably broken, a soul lost to the depths of psychosis. Yet in his moments of semi-lucidity, often triggered by the faint scent of ash that still occasionally permeated the air, Elias would furiously sketch in his notebook. His drawings became more intricate, more detailed. No longer just swirling smoke, but complex patterns. Ancient symbols he'd seen etched in the logbook, now flowing from his trembling hand. He drew maps of the Blackwood Range, not as they appeared on any official chart, but overlaid with glowing lines, intersecting points, and a central pulsing vortex at the location of Sentinel's Roost. These were not random scribbles. They were blueprints of a malevolent power, a hidden geography of dread. He would sometimes whisper, his voice barely audible, fragmented phrases that hinted at a deeper understanding. The seal. It was weak. The heat. It woke it. He spoke of the mountain itself as a living entity, a vast ancient being that breathed and dreamed, and within its dreams, the Ashen Tongue had stirred. He described its hunger not just for grief, but for memory, for the very essence of human experience, twisting it into fuel for its own monstrous existence. He remembered flashes of the previous lookouts, not just their terror, but their lives, their hopes, their small joys, all consumed by the entity, leaving only a hollow echo. Dr. Thorne, despite his professional skepticism, found himself increasingly fascinated by Elias's drawings. He had dismissed the folklore as superstition, but the consistent imagery, the intricate symbols, the sheer volume of Elias's output began to chip away at his scientific certainty. He cross-referenced the symbols with obscure texts on ancient cultures and forgotten spiritual practices, finding unsettling similarities to symbols of containment and release, of elemental spirits and sacrificial rites. He even found a few references to entities that fed on negative emotions, particularly grief and fear, and often associated with natural disasters like wildfires. One afternoon, while reviewing Elias's file, Dr. Thorne noticed a chilling detail. Elias's medical chart mentioned a severe fire in his past, a tragic event that had claimed his family. The details were sparse, but the timing coincided with a period of intense drought in a different region, miles from the Blackwood Range. Could the Ashen Tongue's influence extend beyond the mountain? Could Elias's trauma have been a pre-existing vulnerability, a beacon for the entity even before he arrived at the tower? The thought sent a cold shiver down Dr. Thorne's spine. He tried to engage Elias more directly to understand the source of these delusions. "Elias," he asked gently, "tell me more about the Ashen Tongue. What does it want?" Elias's eyes, usually vacant, flickered with a brief spark of recognition, then a profound terror. "It wants to be free," he whispered, his voice gaining a chilling clarity. "It wants to burn. Not just the trees, the memories, the world. It feeds on the embers of what was." He paused, his gaze fixed on some unseen horror. "And it leaves a mark, a brand, so it can find you again." Dr. Thorne felt a knot of dread tighten in his stomach. The sanitarium, once a bastion of order and reason, now felt permeated by an unseen presence. A subtle chill that defied the building's heating system. The faint scent of ash seemed to linger in the air, a constant, unsettling reminder. He dismissed it as psychosomatic, a product of his own immersion in Elias's case. But the thought, once planted, began to grow. What if this wasn't just a delusion? What if Elias Thorne wasn't just a patient, but a survivor? A victim who had somehow, impossibly, carried a piece of the horror with him. An unseen connection to an ancient evil that now stretched its tendrils into the quiet valley below. The sanitarium's walls, once a symbol of containment, felt increasingly fragile, like paper against an unseen flame. Summer returned to the Blackwood Range, bringing with it a fresh wave of heat and the promise of new life, oblivious to the ancient horror that still stirred beneath its surface. The Sentinel's roost tower was gone, its steel lattice dismantled, its wooden cabin hauled away, leaving only the scarred bedrock of the peak as a silent testament to its past. The Forest Service, eager to move on, had designated the area as a restricted zone for a time, citing environmental recovery. But eventually, the trails were reopened. Unaware of the mountain's true history, new watchers began to arrive. Not fire lookouts, but hikers, backpackers, and nature enthusiasts, drawn by the allure of the remote wilderness and the challenging trails. Among them were Sarah and Tom, a young couple from the city, seeking an escape from the relentless pace of their lives. Sarah, an amateur photographer, was eager to capture the raw beauty of the untouched forest. Tom, a history buff, was intrigued by the tales of old fire lookouts and the solitude they embraced. They set up camp near a pristine mountain lake, miles from the dismantled tower, but still within the vast embrace of the Blackwood Range. The first few days were idyllic. The air was clean, the water clear, the silence profound. Sarah captured breathtaking images of towering pines and sun-dappled clearings. Tom read from his guidebook, recounting stories of early rangers and the challenges they faced. But as the days bled into weeks and the heat intensified, subtle changes began. Sarah noticed strange distortions in her photographs, faint, shimmering blurs in the background that she couldn't explain. They looked like heat haze, but they appeared even in shaded areas, and sometimes she swore she could make out a gaunt, indistinct figure within the blur. She dismissed it as a camera malfunction, or perhaps her own eyes playing tricks. Tom, meanwhile, found himself increasingly drawn to the old unmaintained trails, paths that seemed to lead deeper into the forest, away from the marked routes. He felt an inexplicable pull, a quiet whisper in his mind, urging him onward. He started having vivid, unsettling dreams of fire, of being trapped in a burning structure, of a suffocating smoke that filled his lungs. He would wake in a cold sweat, the scent of ash clinging to his clothes, though their campfire had long since died. One evening, as they sat by their small campfire, the flames crackling merrily, Sarah shivered despite the warmth. "Do you feel that?" she asked, pulling her jacket tighter. "It's like a cold spot." Tom nodded, his gaze distant. "And the smell? Do you smell it?" "Like something's burning, but not wood." The air grew heavy, and the crackle of their campfire seemed to intensify, the flames leaping higher than they should, casting long, dancing shadows that writhed like unseen forms. From the depths of the forest, a faint, sibilant whisper drifted to them, carried on a breeze that stirred no leaves. It was indistinct, but both Sarah and Tom felt a profound sense of sorrow, of ancient grief, wash over them. Tom, his eyes wide, turned to Sarah. "Did you hear that?" Sarah nodded, her face pale. It sounded like crying. They tried to rationalize it. The wind, the creaking trees, the tricks of the mind in the deep wilderness. But the feeling of being watched, of being chosen, grew stronger with each passing day. Tom found himself sketching strange symbols in the dirt with a stick, patterns that seemed to flow from his hand without conscious thought, symbols eerily similar to those Elias Thorne had drawn in his sanitarium. Sarah, looking through her camera lens, swore she saw fleeting, shadowy figures moving between the trees, always just out of focus, always just beyond reach. The Blackwood Range, once a place of refuge, was subtly shifting, its ancient evil stirring once more. The ashen tongue, no longer confined to the tower, was stretching its tendrils, its hunger undiminished. Elias Thorne was merely the first in a new cycle, a warning unheeded. The new watchers had arrived, drawn by an unseen force, and the ancient entity was ready to feed again. The mountains held their breath, waiting for the next spark, the next grief, the next victim to wander into its embrace. The Blackwood Range, having shed its summer skin, now embraced the vibrant hues of autumn. The leaves, once a uniform green, exploded into a riot of fiery reds, oranges, and yellows, a mocking echo of the inferno that had consumed Elias Thorne's mind. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of decaying leaves and damp earth. But beneath it, a faint, acrid tang of ash persisted, a subtle discord in the seasonal symphony. In the valley below, the Blackwood Valley Sanitarium continued its quiet, orderly routine. Elias Thorne remained a patient, his condition stable but unchanged. He was a ghost in the machine, his body present, his mind a fractured landscape of fear and obsession. His drawings, now filling dozens of notebooks, grew increasingly complex, depicting not just the ashen tongue, but intricate networks of energy lines radiating from the former tower site, reaching out like dark veins across the mountain range. He would trace these lines with a trembling finger, muttering about connections and feeding points. Dr. Thorne, increasingly troubled by Elias's unwavering consistency and the unsettling coincidences he had uncovered, found himself drawn deeper into the rabbit hole of local lore. He spoke with retired rangers, with old-timers who had lived in the shadow of the Blackwood Range their entire lives. He heard fragmented tales of unexplained disappearances, of sudden, devastating wildfires that seemed to erupt from nowhere, consuming vast swaths of forest, leaving behind an unnatural silence. He learned of a period, decades ago, when a series of lookouts had vanished from various towers across the range, their fates never truly explained. The common thread, he noted with a growing sense of dread, was always the onset of extreme heat and prolonged isolation. Meanwhile, out in the vast wilderness, the Ashen Tongue's influence began to subtly reemerge, no longer confined to the immediate vicinity of the dismantled tower. Hikers reported strange phenomena. Compasses would spin wildly, radios would crackle with unintelligible whispers, and the air would suddenly drop to an unnatural chill, even on warm, sunny days. Campfires, left unattended for mere moments, would flare up violently, sending sparks high into the dry autumn air, threatening to ignite the entire forest. A group of experienced hunters, deep in the remote northern reaches of the range, reported a chilling incident. They had set up a temporary camp, their dogs restless and agitated, whining and barking at unseen presences. One night, a thick, coiling smoke, black and acrid, began to seep from the ground around their tents, despite no visible fire. It clung to them, burning their throats, filling their lungs with a profound sense of grief and despair. They fled in terror, abandoning their gear, convinced they had stumbled upon something ancient and malevolent. The Forest Service, already on high alert due to the unusually dry conditions, began to receive an increasing number of strange reports. Not just smoke sightings, but accounts of inexplicable electrical disturbances, of animals behaving erratically, fleeing areas en masse. The weather patterns themselves seemed to shift, with sudden, localized heat spikes and unnatural gusts of wind that carried the faint, unmistakable scent of ash. Dr. Thorne, reading these reports in the local newspaper, felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. He looked at Elias Thorne, sitting by the window, tracing an invisible pattern on the glass, his lips moving in a silent, repetitive mantra. It feeds, it waits, it spreads. The doctor had dismissed it as delusion, but now a terrifying possibility began to form in his mind. What if Elias wasn't just a victim, but a sensitive, a conduit who could perceive the entity's movements, its growing power? The Ashen Tongue was no longer bound by the ancient seal beneath the Sentinel's roost. The tower's destruction, rather than containing it, had merely released it, allowing its tendrils to spread, to seek new feeding points across the vast, vulnerable wilderness. The mountain range, once a place of majestic beauty, was suddenly transforming into a vast, silent hunting ground. Its ancient trees now unwitting witnesses to a horror that had awakened, The whispers were returning, carried on the wind, seeking new ears, new minds, new grief to consume. The cycle was not broken. It was merely expanding, and the Blackwood Range held its breath, waiting for the next spark, the next victim. Dr. Thorne found the final drawing tucked beneath Elias's mattress. It was unlike the others, not a frantic sprawl of smoke and terror, but a single, meticulously detailed rendering of the original foundation stone beneath the Sentinel's roost. But where the names of previous lookouts were carved, Elias had added something else, a central, intricate sigil, pulsating with an almost discernible light on the page. Beneath it, a single phrase was scrawled, not in his usual frantic hand, but in a steady, almost calm script. The grief binds, the mind holds, the Sentinel endures. A cold, horrifying realization dawned on Dr. Thorne. The Ashen Tongue, a fire-bound entity, thrived on sorrow, on the memories of loss, on the embers of what was. The tower had been a physical prison, its stones and steel a cage, but the true seal was something else entirely. It was the sustained grief, the consumed sorrow, the minds of those it had broken. Elias hadn't just been a victim. He had been a part of the containment, an unwitting anchor. The tower was gone, its physical seal broken, but the entity still needed a vessel, a nexus for its dark energy. And Elias, consumed by the collective despair, held that potential. Dr. Thorne rushed back to Elias's room, his heart pounding. Elias was sitting up in bed, his eyes still wide, but now a profound, eerie calm had settled over him. He was humming the low, tuneless melody again, but it no longer vibrated with malevolence. It was a mournful, constant drone, like a distant, lonely wind. He looked at Dr. Thorne, and for the first time in months, his vacant eyes held a flicker of true, terrifying lucidity. "It binds," Elias whispered, his voice a soft rustle, like dry leaves. "It draws the sorrow. It needs a place to keep it, a mind, to hold it all." He pointed a trembling finger at his own temple. The tower is gone, but the Sentinel remains. A chill far colder than the winter air permeated the room. Dr. Thorne understood. Elias Thorne hadn't just gone mad. He had made a choice, or perhaps been forced into one. He had become the ultimate eternal sentinel. His fractured mind, saturated with the overwhelming grief it had consumed, was no longer merely a victim's shattered psyche. It was the new prison for the Ashen Tongue. He had become a living, breathing seal, his consciousness eternally bound to the entity, holding its vast, ancient hunger in check. The next morning, Elias Thorne was found unresponsive in his bed. His eyes were wide open, staring blankly at the ceiling. Yet something profound had changed. The desperate fear was gone. The tremors had ceased. His face, though still gaunt, held an expression of profound, almost unsettling peace. He was still breathing, his body alive, but his consciousness was no longer present. It was as if his mind, or his very soul, had become a vast, silent chamber, a containment field for the Ashen Tongue. The aftermath. In the months that followed, the strange phenomena across the Blackwood Range began to cease. The mysterious fires stopped. The acrid scent of ash dissipated from the air. The whispers on the wind faded, replaced by the natural sounds of the wilderness. The unsettling incidents in the sanitarium vanished, and patients suffering from despair slowly, gradually, began to show signs of improvement. The mountains returned to their majestic, indifferent silence. Dr. Thorne never spoke of his final, terrifying realization. He continued his work, a quiet observer of the returned calm. He would sometimes visit Elias, who remained in the sanitarium, seemingly in a deep, perpetual coma, his body alive, yet his mind an impenetrable fortress. Dr. Thorne knew the truth. Elias Thorne, the man, was gone. But in his place, a living prison had been forged, an eternal sentinel whose suffering contained an ancient evil. The cycle was broken, not by force or destruction, but by a horrific, silent sacrifice. The Blackwood Range was safe, its beauty restored, but at a cost only one man would ever truly pay. And in the quiet hum of the sanitarium, Elias Thorne, the eternal sentinel, forever held the ashen tongue captive within the labyrinth of his own mind, ensuring the world slept in peace, unaware of the silent, ceaseless battle raging within the man who had sought solace on a lonely mountain peak. The haunting was finished for the world, but for Elias, it had only just begun its eternal, silent torment.